He survived the war, but a promise changed his life forever. In the middle of the chaos of war, a soldier made a promise that would change his life forever. When his best friend fell before his very eyes, he swore to take care of the family left behind. This is the moving story of Michael Harris, a man scarred by loss, but guided by a commitment that went beyond the battlefield. Get ready to follow a powerful narrative of courage, sacrifice, and hope that will touch every heart. Subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The cold of the early morning seemed to cut through every layer of clothing, and Michael Harris kept his eyes fixed on the dark line ahead, where the horizon blurred with the smoke still rising from the ground. The distant sound of explosions came in uneven intervals, a constant reminder that peace was nothing more than a pause between attacks. Beside him, David Miller adjusted his rifle against his chest, taking deep breaths as he tried to control the tension etched into every muscle of his face. They didn't need long conversations. Quick glances were enough to confirm they were still alive, still together, still standing. The trench reeked of damp earth, gunpowder, and fear, a narrow space that seemed to press down on the men not only physically but in spirit as well. Michael thought of the backyard of his home, the simple wooden porch, the laughter he hadn't heard in so long. Those memories were the only way to keep the emptiness of war from swallowing him whole. The heavy silence didn't last. A sudden burst of detonations made the ground tremble, sending loose dirt falling onto their shoulders. Instinctively, Michael pulled David behind a makeshift wooden barrier, but in that moment, he saw the red spreading quickly across his friend's uniform. Blood soaked the fabric and spread too fast to be stopped easily. Michael pressed his hands against the wound, desperately trying to stem the bleeding while scanning the chaos around them for help. The noise was deafening, and no call for a medic would ever be heard. David's face grew pale, his eyes staring into nothing, his breathing shallow, each gasp like a battle of its own. Michael felt the crushing weight of helplessness, but he refused to back away. David called his name in a faint voice, and the way it sounded made Michael understand this wasn't about orders or strategy. It was something personal, intimate, different. With painful pauses, David spoke of Sarah, his wife, and of their children, Emily and Jacob, still small and waiting for their father to return home. He begged Michael not to leave them alone, to go to them if the worst happened, to take on the responsibility of helping his family carry on. It wasn't a choice, it was a necessity, a final plea from a man who knew his time was slipping away. Michael's chest tightened under the weight of the request, because he fully understood the magnitude of the commitment being placed in his hands. The soldier gripped his friend's hand firmly and gave his word. It wasn't just empty reassurance. It was a vow, spoken with a trembling yet steady voice, leaving no doubt that he would keep it until his last breath. David managed a faint smile through the pain, as if that single yes had lifted part of his burden. With effort, he slid his wedding ring off his finger and placed it in Michael's hand. Then, reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a folded letter he had always kept close, with Sarah's name written in simple letters, and asked that it be delivered untouched. Michael slipped the ring and letter into the inside pocket of his uniform, close to his heart, as though he were carrying not just objects, but the memory and trust of a man who now depended on him. Time ran against them. Each of David's breaths grew shorter, each movement weaker, until silence finally settled in for good. Michael stayed by the body, unable to move, even after the sounds of battle faded into the distance. He touched his friend's face, closed his eyes, and let tears fall quietly. The pain was overwhelming, but beneath it was a new determination, because survival was no longer just about himself. It was about carrying forward a promise. The weight of war had now become the weight of a duty that could never be ignored. As dawn began to break, Michael adjusted his uniform, made sure the letter and ring were secure, and took a deep breath. He knew that from that moment on, every step he took would not be just for himself, but also for David and for the family waiting at home, unaware of what had already happened. The future remained uncertain, but the decision was made. He would return, knock on Sarah's door, look her in the eyes, and tell her that her husband fought to the very end, that he was not forgotten, and that his promise still lived. That vow was now what kept Michael standing stronger than any order, deeper than any fear he might face. The train carrying Michael Harris home seemed to move far too slowly for someone who no longer had anything to look forward to. The car was full of men surviving in silence, each with his eyes fixed on some distant point, too drained to exchange words. The windows showed the landscape passing by, but there was no beauty in it, only memories that didn't connect to what awaited them. Michael wore the same dirty uniform, boots scuffed and worn, his pack light in possessions but heavy in meaning. Among the few items he carried, tucked into the inside pocket of his coat, were David Miller's letter and wedding ring, as if they were part of his own body. The journey home felt endless, as though time itself had stretched to make room for grief. The metallic rhythm of the train never stopped, yet it couldn't drown out the thoughts flooding his mind, memories of David's final glance. Around him, some soldiers dozed with their heads hanging. Others stared blankly ahead, but no one smiled. This was no triumphant return, no celebration, only the bare fact that they were still alive. When the train finally pulled into the small station of his hometown, Michael stepped off with heavy strides. Families crowded the platform, embracing soldiers, tears streaming down faces relieved by reunion. He didn't look for anyone. There was no one waiting for him. The loneliness of arriving unwelcomed cut deeper than any invisible wound from the war. He glanced around, shifted the strap of his pack onto his shoulder, and walked out, the background filled with the joy of others that didn't belong to him. The street leading to his childhood home looked the same, but everything felt different because he had changed. His footsteps echoed on the pavement, each corner holding memories that no longer fit. Passing the porch where he had once spent hours, he noticed the old swing still hanging, now worn and abandoned, incapable of carrying any good memory. The following days dragged on, filled with routines that no longer made sense. Michael tried to reclaim an ordinary life, waking early, doing small chores, running to the local store for essentials, but nothing restored the feeling of normalcy. People looked at him with respect, some even with gratitude, but the silence he carried was heavier than any gesture. He didn't talk about the war, didn't mention names, didn't answer questions. Everything felt too distant to put into words. At night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the memories breaking in without invitation. Nightmares woke him in the middle of the night, and it took all his strength to steady his breath and remind himself he was home. What tormented him most, though, was the memory of the promise. The letter and the ring remained safely with him, untouched, waiting for the moment he would fulfill what had been entrusted. It was after one of those sleepless nights that he made his decision. Sitting at the table with a glass of water in his hand, he realized he could no longer delay. What he carried wasn't just a memory. It was a commitment that demanded action. He thought of Sarah Miller, waiting somewhere for news that would never come easily. He thought of Emily and Jacob, two children who would never truly understand absence without some explanation that could offer peace. He thought of David, of that last look that had asked so much in so little time, and he knew there was nothing left to wait for. He stood up, put on his coat, checked that the items were still with him, and walked out without looking back. Each step toward the Miller home felt heavier than the last, but it was the only direction he could take. The walk to the Miller's house was lined with familiar streets and curious stares. Some people waved, others averted their eyes, unsure how to face a man returning from something they couldn't comprehend. Michael didn't stop to speak to anyone. He kept his eyes straight ahead, steady, determined, as if guided by an invisible hand. When he reached the house, he found a modest structure with a small wooden porch and light curtains in the windows. The garden flowers were poorly tended, signs that routine had already fallen apart. He paused at the gate for a few seconds, drew a deep breath, and gripped the cold iron bars, gathering his courage. His heart pounded, his palms sweated not from fear of war, but from the weight of the meeting about to happen. At last, he raised his hand and knocked on the door. The sound echoed through the house, and the silence that followed felt far longer than it should have. Michael kept his eyes on the wood, the tension growing with each second. When the door opened, Sarah Miller stood there, pale, dark circles under her eyes, her hair hastily tied back, her face marked by waiting. Behind her, 2 children clung to the hem of her dress, staring at the stranger with wide, frightened eyes. Michael swallowed hard, removed his hat in respect, and held his posture. In a low, heavy voice, he said David's name. Sarah's eyes widened, and before she could speak, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded letter and the wedding ring, handing over with trembling hands what he had carried since his friend's final moment. The air thickened, and the children shrank back even further. In that moment, Michael understood that coming home did not mean rest. It meant beginning to fulfill the promise. The silence that filled the room seemed louder than any explosion Michael Harris had ever heard. Sarah Miller stood frozen before him, her eyes locked on the letter in her hand as though she lacked the strength to open it. Emily and Jacob hid behind her, clutching the fabric of her dress, unable to understand what the sight of this uniformed man at their door truly meant. Michael took a hesitant step inside, slipping off his heavy coat and holding it close, searching for words that wouldn't come easily. He spoke David's name again, his voice breaking, and explained that he had been with him until the very last moment. Sarah closed her eyes and let a tear slide down her cheek, but she didn't collapse. She remained upright, breathing deeply, as though she had to keep standing for the sake of the children watching her. Michael lowered himself slowly into a simple chair, waiting for her to accept his presence while the letter remained sealed in her hands, like a barrier between the past and the present. With a brief gesture, Sarah asked Emily to fetch a glass of water. The girl, reluctant but obedient, returned a moment later. That small act seemed to restore a bit of motion to a room paralyzed by grief. Michael used the moment to share what he had promised David. He didn't speak of cruel details or describe the pain. He simply emphasized that his friend had passed with courage and love for his family. Sarah listened silently, the letter still pressed tightly in her hands, unable to break its seal. Jacob, curious, took a few steps toward Michael, watching him with wide, cautious eyes. The soldier offered a faint smile, trying to convey trust, but avoided empty words. After a moment, the boy retreated again, hiding behind his mother, showing how difficult it was to make sense of this stranger's presence. The air shifted between the weight of loss and the need to move forward. At last, Sarah unfolded the letter and read in silence. David's words were simple, but overflowing with emotion. He wrote of his love, of his hope that the family would remain strong, and asked forgiveness for not being there to see the children grow. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth to hold back her sobs, but her trembling shoulders betrayed her. Michael lowered his gaze out of respect, granting her privacy in that intimate moment. Emily, sensing her mother's pain, climbed onto her lap to hold her, and Jacob soon followed, wrapping his arms around her as well. Her tears turned into a fierce embrace, and the letter remained on the table, open, bearing witness to a farewell that could no longer come in person. Michael bowed his head, feeling like an intruder in that family's grief, but also realizing that his promise had truly begun in that very room. Minutes later, Sarah took a deep breath and looked at Michael. She whispered her thanks, unable to say much more, but it was enough to form a fragile bond. She admitted she didn't know how to go on, that the days had already been unbearable even before the final confirmation, and now everything seemed impossible. Michael told her she wouldn't have to face it alone, that David had entrusted him with the duty of being there. He didn't offer easy answers or empty reassurances, only the steady promise that he would do his best to help. Sarah, still guarded, didn't respond right away. She simply looked at her children and back at the letter, as though searching for some sign in her husband's words that she could place her trust in the man before her. The hesitation was natural, but the shared grief was already starting to build a fragile bridge dawn as the afternoon went on. Michael remained in the room, answering the short questions Sarah asked about David's final hours. He told her how David never stopped talking about his family, how each memory gave him strength even on the darkest days. He spoke of the pride David felt as a father and husband, of the stories he repeated about Emily and Jacob just to endure the distance. The children, though too young to understand every detail, listened quietly, absorbing the certainty that their father had not forgotten them. Sarah wiped her tears and, with effort, rose to prepare coffee. It was a simple act, but it marked her acceptance of Michael's presence in her home. He thanked her softly, feeling himself drawn into the family circle, even knowing the pain would not fade overnight. Trust would need to be built step by step. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, Michael stood to leave. He said he would return soon, that he didn't want to intrude, but that David's promise could only be kept through constancy. Sarah, exhausted, simply nodded, her eyes red from crying. Emily and Jacob followed him to the door, curious and uncertain, as though unsure whether to see him as a stranger or as someone carrying a part of their father. Michael placed his hat back on his head, looked at them with quiet warmth, and gave a small wave before stepping out. As he walked down the street, his chest felt heavy but also clearer. He had taken the first step in honoring his vow. Behind the closed door, Sarah held her children tightly and glanced at the letter on the table, still open, a reminder that even in absence, David was still caring for them in some way. That morning, Michael Harris woke before the sun broke through the darkness. His sleep had been shallow, haunted by images that replayed in his mind, as if the sounds of war still echoed inside him. Yet something was different this time, the awareness that he had to act. The meeting with Sarah and the children the day before could not be the end, but the beginning of something greater. He rose slowly, splashed water on his face, slipped on his worn coat, and stepped out into the quiet street. As he walked along the familiar sidewalks of his town, everything seemed different because he was no longer the same man. The cold air filled his lungs, reminding him with each breath that his life was no longer his alone. Sarah had received the news. The children had seen his face, and the vow made to David now had to become presence, constancy. What mattered wasn't memories tucked in his pocket, but actions that could fill the emptiness of daily life. When he reached the Miller house, he saw Sarah opening the window. Her face was marked by exhaustion, but in her eyes, there was a firmness that caught his attention. He gave a slight nod and waited for her to decide whether to let him in. For a moment, she seemed uncertain, but then she opened the door, granting him entry with a simple tilt of her head. Emily and Jacob were already awake, still in their pajamas, watching curiously. Michael removed his hat as a sign of respect and asked if there was anything he could do. Sarah drew a deep breath and mentioned the backyard fence that wobbled with every gust of wind and a kitchen faucet that dripped without pause. Michael thanked her for the trust and went straight to work, avoiding forced conversation. Borrowing a few tools, he rolled up his sleeves and got to it. Each hammer strike rang out as a reminder that he was honoring part of the promise. The children watched through the window, fascinated by the sight. Emily, more outspoken, bombarded Sarah with questions. Would he come back? Would he stay for dinner? Would he be their friend? Jacob just bit his finger, eyes locked on Michael's every move. When the fence was finally reinforced, Michael approached them and said they could now play without fear of it giving way. Emily grinned, ran up, and pushed against the boards, satisfied when they held firm. Jacob let out a shy laugh, the first since Michael had arrived. Sarah stood silently, her expression unreadable. She didn't thank him in words, but the way her shoulders loosened was enough to show her gratitude. It was a small step, but a meaningful one. Michael realized he didn't need immediate recognition. Only patience stopped by late afternoon. He noticed how little there was in the kitchen cupboards. Sarah tried to hide it, serving only weak coffee and stale bread, but Michael could see the shortage. The next morning, he returned with a bag from the local store, grains, milk, and a few vegetables. He set it on the table without a speech, simply saying he had bought extra and thought they might use it. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse, but the eager eyes of the children made her relent. Emily excitedly pulled the items from the bag, smiling as she placed them on the table, and Jacob clapped when he saw the milk. Sarah sighed deeply and, for the first time, clearly said, "Thank you," even though her voice trembled. Michael only gave a small nod, making it clear he expected nothing in return. This wasn't charity. It was the fulfillment of a commitment that was now part of his life. As the days passed, his visits became routine. Michael fixed small problems, gathered firewood, carried water, and sometimes sat at the table to help Emily with her schoolwork. She loved hearing the simple stories he told, never about the war, but always mentioning how proud her father had been of her. Jacob showed him his wooden toy car at each visit, as if it were their secret bond, and Michael would sit on the floor and push it back and forth until the boy laughed. Sarah stayed reserved, but her resistance softened. She no longer saw him only as the bearer of tragedy, but as someone willing to share the weight of absence. Michael felt the promise shifting from memory into reality with every small gesture woven into daily life. One cloudy afternoon, Michael went alone to the cemetery. In his hands, he carried a small bouquet of flowers he had bought in town, simple but sincere. David's headstone stood clean, marked only with his name and the dates, and Michael stood before it in silence for long minutes. No words could capture all that he felt, but quietly he repeated to himself that he was keeping the promise. He whispered that Sarah was not alone, that Emily and Jacob had someone to look after them. As the rain began to fall lightly, dripping down his face, he stayed rooted until his heart steadied. Returning to the Miller house drenched, he found Sarah opening the door without a question. She handed him a dry towel and let him step inside. It was a simple gesture, but filled with meaning. For the first time, she no longer saw Michael as an intruder, but as part of a daily rhythm slowly being rebuilt. Days turned into weeks, and Michael Harris's presence no longer felt out of place inside the Miller home. The initial shock had given way to a quiet coexistence, built on small gestures and shared responsibilities. The children began to wait eagerly for his visits. Emily would rush to the window at the sound of footsteps by the gate, and Jacob would leave his wooden toy car leaning against the door, as if it were an invitation to play. Sarah watched this change cautiously, but she couldn't ignore the renewed joy in her children. Their laughter filled the living room during moments that once felt unbearably heavy. Michael noticed the bond growing without ever needing to force it. All it took was showing up, meeting their needs, and respecting their space. Each day felt like the promise he made to David was being sealed not through words, but through steady, quiet presence. Emily began asking for help with her schoolwork. She would bring her notebooks and pencils to the table, dragging over a chair so Michael could sit beside her. With patience, he explained numbers, read stories aloud, and corrected the shaky words she wrote. Jacob, uninterested in books, insisted on sitting on Michael's lap, rolling his toy car across the table and laughing every time it fell to the floor. Michael found himself smiling in ways he hadn't believed possible since the war. Sarah, across the room washing clothes or sewing, pretended not to notice, but her eyes often drifted toward them. It was impossible to ignore how safe her children felt with him, and that brought her a relief she wasn't ready to admit out loud. One sunny afternoon, Michael took the children into the yard. With a few leftover boards from fixing the fence, he built a small swing tied with strong ropes. Emily beamed as she soared through the air, the wind in her face, while Jacob laughed loudly as Michael pushed him gently. The sound carried beyond the yard, drawing curious neighbors to peek over the fence. It had been a long time since such joyful laughter was heard in that house. Some neighbors waved at Michael, acknowledging his efforts, while others simply watched in silence. Sarah stood on the porch, gripping her apron tightly, torn between gratitude and the fear of becoming too accustomed to his help. The yard, once marked by silence and absence, was slowly turning into a place of life again. Soon, the community began to talk. At the grocery store, people whispered about the veteran devoting his time to his fallen friend's family. Some called him a hero. Others wondered if there was more behind his presence. Michael heard the comments but didn't let them matter. He knew his purpose wasn't shaped by opinions, but by the vow made in those final moments of despair. Even so, the attention had unexpected effects. Others started helping too. Neighbors knocked on Sarah's door with hot meals. Emily's teachers checked in with more care, and even the local pastors stopped by to offer support. Michael's presence not only fulfilled the promise, it awakened a dormant sense of solidarity in the community. Sarah noticed it, even if she didn't speak of it, and the weight on her shoulders began to ease little by little. One calm evening, after the children were tucked in, Sarah found Michael sitting on the porch. He was staring at the sky, lost in thought, as if still carrying conversations with memories that refused to fade. She approached quietly, handed him a cup of hot tea, and sat beside him. They didn't talk about David, and they didn't talk about the war. Instead, they shared a few simple words about the day, the children, the weather. It was the first time Sarah chose to spend a moment with him without formality or resistance. Michael sensed the shift but didn't press it. He respected the quiet comfort, knowing this was her way of saying she accepted his presence. The promise still weighed on his shoulders, but now it shared space with something new, the feeling that he was becoming part of this home. The following Sunday, Michael took Emily and Jacob to the town square. He brought along an old ball he'd found in the garage and played with them until the sun began to set. Emily dashed across the grass with endless energy, while Jacob stumbled, fell, and laughed as he ran back to Michael, who lifted him high as if he were the most precious prize. Passersby stopped to watch, some whispering about how the children no longer looked so burdened. Sarah arrived later with a basket of bread and fruit and sat on a bench nearby, watching the three of them with a different gaze. It was no longer suspicion in her eyes, but a quiet recognition. She knew she couldn't deny it. Michael was keeping his promise, and because of him, her family was finally beginning to breathe again. Time passed, and the days that once felt endless found a new rhythm inside the Miller household. Emily had grown. She was no longer the little girl who hid behind her mother, but a curious young woman who now helped Sarah with chores and cared for her younger brother with a maturity beyond her years. Jacob had long since set aside his wooden toy car in the corner of the living room, yet his face still lit up with a smile every time Michael arrived, as though that reaction had been woven into his childhood. Michael remained a steady presence, constant and reliable, keeping the promise not through words, but through every detail. Repairing a broken chair, helping with school lessons, extending a hand whenever Sarah needed it. The house, once marked by silence, was now filled with footsteps, voices, and laughter. There was no replacement, but there was continuity. Sarah no longer saw Michael as a guest. He came in without waiting for permission, laid logs on the fire, helped prepare meals, and took his place at the table naturally. The children treated him like family, and the community came to recognize him as such. It wasn't unusual to hear neighbors remark how much stronger, happier, and more confident Emily and Jacob seemed. In moments of honesty, Sarah admitted to herself that she could never have managed alone. Michael's presence had become a pillar, supporting not just the household, but the hope she once thought was gone. Still, David was never replaced. What existed was deep respect, a bridge between memory and the present, upheld by the commitment one man had made at the threshold of another's death. On a clear weekend morning, Sarah suggested they all visit the cemetery together. Emily carried white flowers carefully wrapped in plain paper, while Jacob insisted on bringing the wooden toy car, even though he no longer played with it. Michael walked beside them, his heart heavy yet steady, knowing this moment was an essential part of his vow. At David's grave, they cleaned the headstone carefully, brushing away dry leaves, and placed the flowers at its center. Jacob knelt and set the toy car at the base, whispering softly that it was a gift for his father. Sarah was overcome, covering her face with her hands, while Emily clasped her hand tightly. Michael stood in silence, hat pressed to his chest. As he always did in moments of reverence, thought it was then that Sarah, her voice thick with emotion, thanked him, not only for the visit, but for all the years of constancy, for never letting the promise fade with time. She said that because of Michael, the children had grown surrounded by care, and she herself had found the strength to carry on. Emily nodded, her eyes shining, and Jacob ran to wrap his arms around Michael's waist. No words needed. Michael drew in a deep breath, feeling the weight of duty fulfilled, and knelt to rest his hand on the headstone. In a quiet voice, he said the promise had been kept, that the family was safe, that David's presence was still there, unseen but real. It was a moment of private closure, not for the world, but for the small circle that had become his life. The walk home was filled with a serene quiet. Sarah walked beside the children, and Michael followed close behind, his steps calm. There was a new kind of peace in the air, the peace of knowing that grief never vanishes, but it can be transformed into strength. Emily chattered about school. Jacob ran ahead balancing a small stone on his head, and Sarah smiled faintly as she watched them. Michael knew David would have been proud of the family he left behind, and in his heart, he felt David would have been proud of how the promise had been honored. There were no medals, no glory, only the certainty that he had done what needed to be done. As night fell, and they returned to the porch of the house, Michael sat on the wooden step, watching Emily and Jacob play before bed. Sarah brought out 2 mugs of hot tea and sat beside him. Few words were spoken. None were needed. The silence they shared was enough to affirm that they were bound by the same tie. Michael looked up at the stars beginning to appear and thought of David once more. He asked for nothing, explained nothing, only felt the calm of knowing that, in the end, his friend had not left alone. The promise had become life, and in that simple home, it had found its true meaning. The end. So, what did you think of this story? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to keep enjoying stories like this one. See you next time.